Most people think the most dangerous part of witness protection is the hitmen, the wiretaps, or the old associates with long memories. They're wrong. The most dangerous thing in my world was a woman named Beatrice Vane, a clipboard, and a deep-seated obsession with aesthetic harmony. Right now, I'm standing on a rain-slicked porch in the middle of a forest that doesn't exist on any map, holding a Glock 17 and wondering if the man in my driveway is a process server or an assassin. This started because I left my recycling bin 3 inches too far to the left in a neighborhood called Cedar Cove. Beatrice didn't just want to find me, she wanted to know me. And in my line of work, being known is a death sentence. Stick around, because I'm about to show you exactly how a bored HOA president managed to do what the mob couldn't. She found me. And trust me, by the time the US Marshals kick in the doors, you'll never look at your neighbors the same way again. Today's story is from Arthur Ashford. It's not his real name, but it's the name he's currently known by. He's a man whose entire existence is a carefully constructed lie designed by the US Marshals to keep him one step ahead of a lethal past. To the neighbors in Cedar Cove, he is just a forgettable, retired actuary with a penchant for birdwatching. But beneath that beige polo shirt lies a protected federal witness who knows exactly how much a single slip-up can cost. The air in Cedar Cove smelled of fresh mulch, pressurized sprinkler water, and expensive compliance. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt monitored. As I backed my silver SUV, a vehicle so aggressively average it practically vanished the moment it was parked, into the driveway of number 14, I kept my eyes on the mirrors. I wasn't looking for kids on tricycles or the stray golden retrievers that seemed to be a neighborhood requirement. I was looking for the silhouette I knew was hovering behind the sheer curtains of number 12. Beatrice Vane, HOA President, the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac. I killed the engine and sat for a second, letting the air conditioning hum against the humid afternoon. My hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2. I had to remind myself. Arthur Ashford, retired actuary. Des Moines, birdwatcher. Mild salsa. Arthur was a ghost designed by a committee of federal marshals in a windowless room in D.C. He was a man with no rough edges, no debt, and most importantly, no history. I stepped out, smoothing my polo shirt, a shade of beige that matched the harvest sand stucco of my new home. In Cedar Cove, even the dirt was regulated. Mr. Ashford, moving day is always such a whirlwind, isn't it? The voice was like a violin string stretched a half-turn too tight. I turned to see Beatrice marching across the property line. She didn't walk. She patoled. She was in her late 50s, wearing a visor that looked like a riot shield and carrying a clipboard that she gripped like a weapon of war. Just the essentials today, Miss Vane, I said, forcing a pleasant, slightly vacant smile. The rest is coming from storage in a few weeks. It's actually Beatrice to my neighbors, Arthur. We're very informal here, provided the rules are followed. She stopped exactly 3 feet away, well inside my personal bubble. Her eyes were high-definition cameras, darting from my face to the open trunk of my SUV. I saw her gaze linger on a cardboard box labeled kitchen. It was sealed with standard packing tape, but she looked at it as if she could X-ray the contents. She was searching for a stray brand name, a high school logo, a forgotten luggage tag, anything that didn't scream Iowa actuary. "I've brought you the welcome packet," she said, thrusting a thick, plastic-bound folder toward me. "The Cedar Cove Covenants. I've taken the liberty of highlighting the sections on exterior lighting, waste management, and unauthorized overnight curb occupancy. We take our aesthetic harmony very seriously here." "I appreciate that," I said, taking the folder. The weight of it was surprising. Nearly 200 pages of how to live. I'm a man who likes order. It's why I went into insurance. "I can see that." Her eyes dropped to my wrist. I'd made a mistake. I'd forgotten to swap out my watch. I was still wearing the heavy, scarred diver's piece I'd had since my days on the docks. It was titanium, scratched from a dozen things an actuary should never encounter. It didn't fit the beige polo. It looked like something a man wears when he needs to know exactly how many minutes of oxygen he has left in a sinking car. Beatrice smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. They remained cold, analytical. "That's a very rugged timepiece for a man of numbers, Arthur. An heirloom? Or perhaps from your time in— where did you say you relocated from?" "Des Moines," I lied smoothly. "And the watch was a gift from a firm I consulted for in Chicago. a retirement send-off. I watched the mental gears turn. Chicago. She'd be at her desktop within the hour, Googling Ashford Actuary Chicago and finding exactly what the Marshals had planted. A LinkedIn profile with 300 connections and a digital footprint as wide as a toothpick. How lovely, she whispered, her pen hovering over her clipboard as if she were grading my performance. She backed away slowly, never taking her eyes off mine. I'll leave you to your boxes. But do remember, Arthur, in Cedar Cove, we don't just live next to each other. We look out for one another, whether people want us to or not. I watched her retreat to number 12, her gait stiff and purposeful. As I hauled the first box into the empty, echoing hallway of my new life, I felt a familiar prickle at the base of my neck. The Marshals had told me the safest place for a man with a price on his head was a boring suburb where nothing ever happened. They were wrong. They didn't realize that in a place where nothing happens, a man with no past is the only thing worth watching. I closed the door and locked all 3 deadbolts. I didn't turn on the lights. I just stood in the dark, wondering how long it would take for Beatrice Vane to realize that Arthur Ashford didn't actually exist. I survived 20 years in the underworld by noticing the things that weren't there. A missing car on a street corner, a silenced phone, a look that lingered a second too long. In Cedar Cove, however, the danger wasn't what was missing. It was what had been moved. Tuesday was Refuse and Reclamation Day, according to the laminated calendar Beatrice had shoved into my hands. The covenants were specific. Bins were to be placed exactly 18 inches from the curb, handles facing the house, out no earlier than 6 a.m. and retrieved no later than 7 p.m. Failure to comply resulted in a Tier 1 aesthetic variance fine. I'd been careful. I spent Monday night shredding every scrap of paper that arrived in my transition folders. I didn't even trust the government-issued history documents to the bin. Those went into a small portable incinerator I kept in the garage. My recycling bin contained nothing but 3 empty sparkling water glass bottles, unflavored, very Arthur, and a flattened cardboard box from a high-end toaster. At 3:15 a.m., the red glow of my security monitor, hidden inside a hollowed-out grandfather clock in the hallway, blinked once. I didn't move from the bed. I just opened my eyes and watched the tablet on my nightstand. The night vision feed from the porch camera was grainy, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Beatrice Vane was on my driveway. She wasn't wearing her visor. She had a dark, high-performance tracksuit on and a headlamp dimmed with red film to preserve her night vision. She didn't just look at the bin. She opened it with the practiced ease of a safecracker. I watched her gloved hand reach in, pull out one of the glass bottles, and tilt it toward her headlamp. She was looking for residue, a label, a vintage. She ran a finger along the rim before moving to the toaster box. She didn't just check the cardboard. She was looking for the shipping label I'd already carefully peeled off. She spent 4 minutes on a single bin, her movements methodical and clinical. She wasn't checking for compliance. She was auditing my soul, looking for the one loose thread she could pull to unravel the fabric of Arthur Ashford. When she finished, she didn't just walk away. She looked directly at my darkened front window, as if she could see me watching her, and then she deliberately nudged my bin 3 inches to the left with the toe of her sneaker. The next morning, at exactly 8:02 a.m., there was a sharp, rhythmic knock at the door. "Arthur, good morning. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Beatrice stood on my porch, holding a digital camera and a bright orange slip of paper. She looked refreshed, her eyes bright, as if the midnight dumpster diving had been more revitalizing than a full night's sleep. "Morning, Beatrice," I said, leaning against the doorframe, my body positioned to block her view of the hallway. "Up with the birds, I see." "Always. The early bird catches the, well, you know how it goes." She held up the orange slip with a flourish. "I'm afraid we have a small situation. Citation 4 years 2, B. Improper bin placement and aesthetic nonconformity. It disrupts the visual flow of the cul-de-sac." I looked past her. My bin was sitting skewed, a lonely, crooked sentinel on the otherwise perfect driveway. "It does look a bit off," I conceded, my voice pitched at a level of mild suburban concern. "The wind, maybe?" "It was a bit gusty last night." "We didn't have any wind last night, Arthur," she said, her voice dropping into that terrifyingly helpful register used by people who know they have the upper hand. "I noticed it during my morning power walk, and while I was straightening it for you, to save you the fine initially, I noticed something rather troubling." She clicked the playback on her camera and turned the screen toward me. It was a high-resolution macro photo of the bottom of my recycling bin. There, caught in the plastic seam, was a tiny, microscopic fleck of blue paper. Cedar Cove has a strict, no mixed paper policy for the glass bins, she said, her eyes locking onto mine, searching for a flinch, a bead of sweat, anything. This looks like a fragment of a prescription receipt? It's hard to tell without a closer look. But that specific shade of blue is quite distinctive. Only a few specialized pharmacies use that grade of thermal paper, mostly federal or military clinics. Do you have any chronic conditions, Arthur? We like to keep a list of vulnerable residents in case of a power outage. My heart didn't speed up. I'd spent years training it to stay steady under pressure, but my skin went cold. The Marshals had given me a bottle of high blood pressure meds to fill out the aging actuary persona. I'd burnt the receipt, but a corner must have static clung to the side of the bin. It's likely just a piece of a grocery list, Beatrice, I said, my voice as flat and uninteresting as the Iowa plains. But I'll be sure to scrub the bin. Wouldn't want to upset the aesthetic harmony of the cove. See that you do? She said. She leaned in closer, the scent of her floral perfume clashing with the metallic tang of the morning air. You know, Arthur, most people who move here are so eager to tell me their life stories. Their grandkids, their golf handicaps, their favorite brand of gin. But you're a vault. It makes a person wonder what exactly is being kept inside. Just boring actuarial tables and bird-watching logs, I promise. She patted my arm. Her touch was cold and clinical. We'll see. Oh, and Arthur? Your lawn. 2 inches. That's the rule. Anything less, and the roots burn. Anything more, and it looks like a jungle. We wouldn't want a second citation in one day, would we? She turned and marched toward number 12, her clipboard tucked under her arm like a baton. I went back inside, closed the door, and headed straight for the grandfather clock. I tapped in a 12-digit code, and the screen shifted from the porch feed to an encrypted, high-security messaging app. The reply came back 45 seconds later. Deputy M, stand fast. Do not engage or antagonize. We are pulling her tax records and digital footprint now. If she digs, she will hit the bedrock we built for you. Just be the ghost, Arthur. That is an order. I looked out the window. Beatrice was standing on her own lawn, staring directly at my house, her pen poised over her clipboard. I wasn't a ghost. I was a target, and Beatrice Vane had just found the first loose thread. The invitation was hand-delivered, tucked into a cream-colored envelope with the Cedar Cove crest embossed on the flap. Neighborhood Safety and Awareness Seminar, it read. Thursday, 7 p.m. Number 12. Attendance mandatory for new residents. I looked at the card, then at the grandfather clock. I knew what this was. In my old life, this was called an interrogation under hot lights. In the suburbs, it was served with chamomile tea and lemon squares. Arthur, so glad you could make it, Beatrice chirped as I stepped into her foyer. Her house was a museum of control. Every pillow was karate chopped in the center. Every book on the shelf was alphabetized by author. There were 4 others there. Chatty Cathy from number 9, a retired dentist named Miller, and a young couple who looked like they were already reconsidering their mortgage. Beatrice led me to a wingback chair that felt suspiciously like a witness stand. Now, Beatrice began, clicking a laser pointer at a projection screen she'd set up in her living room. We've had some anomalies in the cove recently. Unidentified vehicles, unfamiliar faces, and of course, the matter of the non-compliant recycling. She flashed a slide of my crooked bin onto the screen. Cathy gasped. I kept my face as wooden as the chair. Security is a shared responsibility, Beatrice continued, her eyes drifting to me. That's why I've asked everyone to share a bit more about their previous lives. Knowing our neighbors' backgrounds helps us identify who belongs and who is a foreign element. Arthur, why don't you start? You mentioned Chicago and Des Moines. Such a vast difference in actuarial climates. I took a sip of tea. It was lukewarm. Not much to tell, Beatrice. Life in Des Moines is mostly about assessing crop yields and storm damage. Chicago was more of the same, just with more wind. And your firm? She pressed, her finger hovering over a key on her laptop. I tried to look up Ashford and Associates in the Chicago Loop. Strangely, the building listed on their old digital archive was demolished 3 years ago. A real shame. It makes it so hard to verify, well, Anything. The room went quiet. I could feel the dentist looking at me. This was her move. The accidental discovery. It was a boutique firm, I said, my voice steady. Most of our records went digital before the wrecking ball hit. I'm surprised you went to so much trouble. I'm just a man who likes birds and quiet streets. Oh, it was no trouble, Beatrice said, her smile sharpening. I have a nephew in digital forensics. He finds it fascinating when a person has a social security number that only seems to activate in their 50s. It's like you were born at the age of retirement, Arthur. Quite a medical marvel. The young couple shifted uncomfortably. They knew she was hunting, even if they didn't know the prey. I've lived a quiet life, I repeated. It was the mantra the Marshals gave me. If you say it enough, it's supposed to become true. A quiet life leaves a trail, Arthur. Only a silent one leaves nothing. Beatrice clicked to the next slide. It wasn't a graph. It was a grainy photo of a man in a dark suit sitting in a black sedan at the entrance of Cedar Cove. My handler, Miller. This man has been seen 3 times this week, Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and triumph. He doesn't live here. He doesn't have a visitor's pass. And yet, he seems very interested in your driveway. She turned the lights up. The interrogation was over. The indictment had begun. Who is he, Arthur? Because I've already sent his plate number to a contact at the state police. If you're in trouble, the Cove needs to know. If you are the trouble, well, the covenants have a very clear clause regarding public nuisance and safety risks. I stood up. I didn't look at the others. I looked only at Beatrice. For a split second, I let the Arthur mask slip, just enough for her to see the man who had looked into the eyes of killers and didn't blink. Her breath hitched. He's a friend from my old life, Beatrice, I said, my voice dropping an octave. And in my old life, people learned very quickly that some questions are more expensive than the answers are worth. I walked out before she could respond. As I crossed the street to number 14, my phone vibrated in my pocket. Deputy M, she's pinged the plates. We're intercepting the request at the state level. She's officially interfering with a federal operation. Arthur, the situation is turning red. Prepare for extraction or lockdown. I didn't go to bed. I sat in the dark living room, watching the feed from the grandfather clock. At 2 a.m., I saw Beatrice Vane come out of her house. She wasn't carrying a clipboard this time. She was carrying a digital SLR camera with a telephoto lens, and she was heading straight for my crawlspace vent. She wanted my secrets. She was about to find out that the federal government is very protective of its property. I sat in the dark of my living room, the only light coming from the dull green glow of the encrypted tablet. On the screen, Beatrice was a grainy gray ghost moving across my sideline. She was stay low to the ground focused, her SLR camera swinging from her neck like a pendulum. She wasn't looking for bins anymore. She was looking for a way in. I watched her kneel by the crawlspace vent. Most people wouldn't even notice it. A small, slatted iron grate designed to keep out moisture and rodents. But Beatrice wasn't most people. She'd probably spent the last 3 hours Googling the architectural blueprints for every house in Cedar Cove. She knew that's where the cable lines and the main data trunk entered the house. She pulled a small black device from her tracksuit pocket, a Wi-Fi sniffer. She was trying to hijack my network, looking for a digital handshake that would tell her who Arthur Ashford really was. I didn't call the Marshals. Not yet. Deputy Miller had told me to be a ghost, but sometimes a ghost needs to rattle a few chains. I stood up, my movements silent, and walked to the kitchen. I grabbed a glass of water, not to drink, but to have an excuse. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. Instead, I triggered the away sequence on my smart home app. Outside, the motion-activated floodlights at the rear of the house kicked on with a sharp clack. On the monitor, I saw Beatrice bolt upright. She froze, pinned against the stucco like a moth to a collection board. She stayed there for a full minute, her chest heaving, the red film of her headlamp reflecting off the glass of her lens. I waited until she started to retreat toward the property line. Then I stepped onto the back porch. I didn't shout. I didn't run. I just stood there in the shadows, silhouetted by the kitchen light. Can't sleep either, Beatrice? She jumped, nearly dropping the camera. She spun around, her face pale in the harsh LED glare. Arthur, goodness, you startled me. I thought I saw a raccoon. A very large one. Possibly rabid. We can't have pests nesting in the foundations. It affects the property values of the entire block. A raccoon, I repeated. I stepped down the first stair. With a Nikon and a frequency scanner? She bristled, her terror instantly pivoting back into the sharp, bureaucratic arrogance that was her natural state. She tucked the scanner into her pocket. It's a light meter, Arthur. I was checking the lumens output of your security lights. There have been complaints about light pollution from the neighbors. We have very strict dark sky initiatives here in the Cove. It's 2:15 a.m., Beatrice. The Covenants don't sleep, Arthur. She stepped closer, her eyes darting to the tablet I was still holding. And neither, it seems, do you. Why so guarded? A man with nothing to hide usually sleeps like a baby. I spent 30 years calculating the odds of accidents, I said, letting a bit of the old iron creep into my voice. The odds of a raccoon carrying high-end surveillance gear at 2 in the morning are statistically insignificant. She smiled then. It wasn't the fake, neighborly smile from the safety seminar. It was the smile of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. You're very good, Arthur. The Des Moines accent is almost perfect. But you forgot one thing. I was a head of HR for a Fortune 500 firm for 22 years. I've smelled a fake resume from a mile away since the 90s. And yours? Yours is the most beautiful work of fiction I've ever read. She leaned in, her voice a low hiss. I don't know if you're a criminal, a disgraced politician, or a man running from a wife, but I will find out. And when I do, I'll strip you of that harvest sand stucco and have you evicted for moral turpitude before the sun sets. She turned on her heel and marched back to number 12, her posture as straight as a ruler. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table. My heart was steady, but my mind was racing. She was smart, smarter than the Marshals had anticipated. She wasn't just a bored retiree. She was a professional hunter who had found a new career in neighborhood gatekeeping. The tablet buzzed. A new message from Miller. Deputy M, we flagged a suspicious login attempt on your local node. Origin, Vane's IP. She's crossed the line into cyber espionage, Arthur. We're moving from observation to active intervention. Stay inside. Do not, repeat, do not, confront her again. I looked at the message, then out the window at Beatrice's house. A single light was on in her upstairs office. I knew what she was doing. She was uploading whatever data she'd managed to sniff from my router. She thought she was protecting her neighborhood. She didn't realize she was poking a hole in a federal veil, and the vacuum on the other side was about to suck her whole life in. The sun hadn't even cleared the manicured tree line of Cedar Cove when the registered mail arrived. It wasn't a clip-on flyer or a friendly note tucked under a windshield wiper. It was a formal, legal-sized envelope with a silver foil seal. The Architectural and Residency Review Committee. I opened it over a cup of black coffee. Arthur Ashford liked cream and sugar, but this morning, I needed the bite of the bean to keep the retired actuary from falling asleep at the wheel. Residency verification and covenant compliance hearing. Dear Mr. Ashford, due to inconsistencies in your initial application and reported concerns regarding the moral character clauses of the Cedar Cove Charter, you are required to present original, notarized documentation of birth, previous residency, and employment history. Failure to comply will result in an immediate cease and desist of residency. Beatrice wasn't just poking at the dirt anymore. She was trying to dig up the foundation. The hearing was held in the community clubhouse, a structure of glass and polished stone that felt more like a courtroom than a recreation center. Beatrice sat at a long mahogany table, flanked by the retired dentist, Miller, and a woman I hadn't met who looked like she'd spent her life auditing tax returns. Arthur, Beatrice said, her voice echoing in the vaulted room. She wasn't wearing her visor today. She was in a sharp power suit, her hair pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to pull her eyes into a squint. Thank you for joining us. We've had some clerical difficulties with your file. I brought the paperwork you requested, I said, placing a manila folder on the table. Inside were the masterpieces of the U.S. Marshals Forgery Department, a birth certificate from a hospital that had burned down in the 70s, a social security card with just the right amount of wear, and tax returns from a shell corporation in Des Moines. Beatrice didn't even look at them. She pushed the folder aside with one manicured finger. We've moved past paper, Arthur, she whispered. The room was silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. Paper can be printed. Paper can be faked. But lives leave a wake. I spent last night on a conference call with a former colleague in Chicago. They checked the professional registry for actuaries. There is no Arthur Ashford listed for the last 30 years. Not in Illinois, not in Iowa, not anywhere. The dentist cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. Beatrice, perhaps there's a spelling error. Or, there is no error, Miller, she snapped, her eyes never leaving mine. Arthur here is a ghost, a fabrication, and under Article 12, Section 4 of our covenants, providing false information on a residency application is grounds for immediate foreclosure and eviction. She leaned forward, her shadow stretching across the table. Who are you? Are you on the run? Is that man in the black sedan your partner? Or is he the man sent to kill you? I felt the vibration in my pocket. 3 short bursts. The red alert signal from Miller. They were on site. Beatrice, I said, my voice dropping into a register that made the dentist flinch. You've spent your life looking for bad fits in HR. You think you're protecting this neighborhood from a foreign element, but you have no idea what you've invited into this room. Is that a threat? She gasped, her hand flying to her throat. She looked at the other committee members. You see, he's unstable. He's a danger to the cove. It's not a threat, I said, standing up. It's a courtesy. You've been sniffing at a federal veil, Beatrice. You've been using private investigators to ping protected databases. You've been intercepting mail. You think you're the law in Cedar Cove? You're about to meet the people who actually write it. The double doors at the back of the clubhouse swung open. 4 men in windbreakers with U.S. Marshals stenciled in bold yellow across the back walked in. At the lead was Deputy Miller, looking significantly less suburban than he had in the black sedan. Beatrice stood up, her face turning a mottled purple. What is the meaning of this? This is a private meeting. You're trespassing on HOA property. Deputy Miller didn't look at her. He looked at me. Arthur, we're compromised. Extraction is authorized. Pack the go bag. Then he turned to Beatrice, pulling a badge from his belt. Ms. Vane, you are under investigation for the unauthorized surveillance of a federal witness, identity theft, and interference with a Department of Justice operation. We have a warrant for your home office, your laptop, and every secret file you've been keeping on your neighbors. Beatrice's jaw dropped. The clipboard she'd been holding slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the polished stone floor. I was just checking the bins, she stammered. The aesthetic harmony just became a federal crime, Miller said coldly. I walked past her without a word. As I exited the clubhouse, I saw the black SUVs pulling onto the curb of the cul-de-sac. My life as Arthur Ashford was over. I had 3 minutes to grab my real life from the floorboards of number 14 and vanish into the next harvest sand-colored suburb. I looked back at Beatrice, who was being read her rights in the middle of her own kingdom. She'd finally found the secret she was looking for. I wondered if she thought it was worth it. The safe house was a gray site in a nondescript industrial park 2 counties over. No harvest sand stucco here, just poured concrete, humming fluorescent lights, and the smell of stale coffee and ozone. I sat on a metal folding chair, my Arthur Ashford polo shirt feeling like a costume that had shrunk in the wash. Across from me, Deputy Miller was leaning against a laminate desk, tossing a thumb drive, Beatrice's thumb drive, up and down in his palm. She's thorough, Arthur. I'll give her that, Miller said, his voice flat. If she wasn't such a bureaucratic sociopath, we could have hired her for research. How bad is it? I asked. My hands were steady, but the phantom itch of a life left behind was starting to set in. I'd like that toaster. I'd like the silence of the bird-watching logs. Miller plugged the drive into a hardened laptop and turned the screen toward me. It wasn't just the recycling, Arthur. She didn't just sniff your Wi-Fi. She had a long-range parabolic microphone hidden in a birdhouse on her porch. She's been recording your phone calls for 3 weeks. I felt a cold prickle. I'd only made 2 calls, both to the Marshals relay line. She couldn't crack our encryption, Miller continued, scrolling through a directory of folders labeled by house number. Number 9, Miller, dentist. Number 15, the Henderson kids. Number 14, Ashford. But she didn't need to. She was tracking the frequency of the pings. She figured out you were communicating with a government-level server. That's why she escalated to the identity review hearing. She thought she was catching a spy or a high-level mole. He clicked into the number 14 folder. There were dozens of photos. Me getting the mail. Me pruning the roses. Me staring out the window at 3 a.m. But then he opened a subfolder titled Cross-Reference. My breath hitched. It was a side-by-side comparison. On the left, My current Arthur face. On the right, a grainy, 20-year-old surveillance photo from a dockside sting in Jersey. My old face. The one with the scar across the chin and the eyes that didn't know how to look retired yet. She used an AI facial recognition API. She bought off a dark web forum, Miller said, his expression grim. She didn't know who you were, but she knew that face was in a federal database. She'd flagged it for a deep search on a private investigator's server in Moldova. If we hadn't kicked in her door when we did, that photo would have hit the open market in 6 hours. The room felt smaller. The bedrock the Marshals had built for me hadn't been deep enough for a woman with a clipboard and too much time on her hands. What happens to her? I asked. The DOJ is throwing the book at her. Privacy violations, wiretapping, computer fraud, and, this is the big one, willful endangerment of a federal witness. She's looking at 15 to 20 in a federal facility. No HOAs there, Arthur. Just a warden and a very strict dress code. I stood up and walked to the small, reinforced window. Outside, the sun was setting over a parking lot full of delivery vans. And me? Miller sighed. The sound of a man who had done this too many times. Cedar Cove is dead. Arthur Ashford is dead. We're moving you to a rural site in the Pacific Northwest. No neighbors for 3 miles. No HOAs. Just trees and rain. I'll miss the roses, I said quietly. You'll like the pines better, Miller replied, handing me a new manila envelope. Meet Thomas Miller, retired park ranger, from Spokane. You like fly fishing now, Thomas? I took the envelope. I didn't look inside. I just thought about Beatrice Vane, sitting in a holding cell, probably complaining about the aesthetic nonconformity of the orange jumpsuit. She'd wanted to find out who I was so badly she'd destroyed both our lives to do it. One more thing, Miller said as I headed for the door. We searched her secret files on the rest of the neighborhood. She had dirt on everyone. The dentist was skimming from his practice. The young couple at number 22? They're running an unlicensed crypto farm in their basement. The whole cul-de-sac was a powder keg of secrets. I managed a grim smile. Maybe she was right. Maybe we all did look out for one another. I stepped out into the humid night, leaving Arthur Ashford on the floor of the safe house like a discarded skin. I had a long drive ahead of me, and a lot of fish to learn about. The rain in the Pacific Northwest didn't smell like cedar mulch and OA-approved fertilizer. It smelled of ancient rot, damp pine needles, and the kind of isolation that felt heavy, like a lead blanket. I was no longer Arthur Ashford. I was Thomas Miller, a retired park ranger with a bad knee and a penchant for fly fishing. My harvest sand stucco had been traded for a cabin made of dark, weathered logs nestled in a notch of the Olympic Peninsula. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles down a gravel track that turned into a soup of gray mud the moment the clouds broke. No more clipboards, Thomas, Deputy Miller, no relation, though the Marshals found the coincidence amusing, had said when he dropped me off. Just trees, trout, and the occasional elk. If you see a human being out here, they're lost, or they're us. I spent the first 2 days sanitizing the cabin. It was a ritual now. I checked the floorboards for bugs, the chimney for thermal sensors, and the perimeter for tripwires. I lived out of the manila envelope for 48 hours, memorizing the names of my fictional Spokane high school teachers and the specific weight of a sagefly rod. By the third morning, the silence was starting to ring in my ears. I missed the low hum of the Cedar Cove leaf blowers. It was a dangerous thought. Nostalgia is a luxury a ghost can't afford. I stepped onto the porch to check the rain gauge. That's when I saw it. Tucked into the handle of my front door was a small, damp envelope. It wasn't cream-colored, and it didn't have an embossed crest. It was a cheap, lined page torn from a spiral notebook, folded into a precarious square. My hand went to the small of my back. Habit die hard. But there was no peace there, just the cold air of the porch. I picked up the note with a pair of pliers I kept by the door. Welcome to the woods, neighbor. It read in a shaky, looping script. I noticed your chimney wasn't smoking yesterday. The flue in that cabin sticks when it's damp. Give it a hard yank to the left. Also, I've got extra sourdough starter if you're a baking man. I'm at the end of the fire road. Silas. I felt a cold spike of adrenaline. Silas. I went back inside and locked the door. I pulled out the encrypted tablet. User. T. Miller 7 to Deputy. M message. I have contact. Note on the door. Name is Silas. Claiming to be a neighbor at the end of the fire road. You told me this was a 3-mile buffer zone. Confirm identity. I waited. 10 minutes. 20. The rain hammered against the tin roof, sounding like 1,000 tiny fingers tapping on the glass. The tablet buzzed. Checking. Standby. We have no Silas registered on the adjacent parcels. The land at the end of the fire road is state-protected timber. There shouldn't be a house there, Thomas. I looked at the note again. I noticed your chimney wasn't smoking. He'd been watching me, not from a window across a manicured cul-de-sac, but from the tree line. Beatrice Vane had used high-end tech and HOA bylaws to hunt me. This Silas was using the woods. I walked to the window and looked out into the mist. Somewhere out there, past the hemlocks and the fog, was a man who knew my flue stuck and knew when I wasn't burning wood. I didn't reach for a bird-watching log. I reached for the heavy iron fire poker. I'd traded one overseer for another. Only this time, there were no covenants to protect me, just the deep, dark silence of the forest. The fog didn't just sit on the Olympic Peninsula, it owned it. It was a thick, wet wool that muffled the sound of my boots on the gravel of the fire road. I wasn't Thomas Miller, the retired ranger today. I was the man I used to be, the one who moved through the shadows of the Jersey shipyards before the sun came up. I hiked for 2 miles, the iron fire poker tucked into the heavy sleeve of my wax canvas coat. It was a primitive weapon, but in these woods, high-tech gadgets felt like toys. The road narrowed until it was nothing more than 2 muddy ruts separated by a spine of moss. Then, the trees broke. At the very end of the track sat a cabin that made mine look like a palace. It was a leaning shanty of silvered cedar and rusted corrugated tin. Smoke, thick, sweet-smelling peat smoke, curled lazy and gray from a stone chimney. On the porch sat a man. He was old, his face a map of deep canyons and sun-bleached stubble. He was wearing a flannel shirt that had faded to the color of dried blood and was busy whittling a piece of driftwood. He didn't look up as I approached, but he stopped carving. "You're a heavy walker, Thomas," he said. His voice sounded like 2 stones rubbing together. "Most rangers learn to roll their weight. You stomp like a city man." I stopped 10 feet from the porch. My hand tightened on the iron in my sleeve. The note said Silas. "I'm Thomas." "I know who you are," he said, finally looking up. His eyes weren't the sharp, predatory blue of Beatrice Vane. They were a milky, clouded gray, cataracts. The man was nearly blind. "Or at least, I know what you are. You're another one of the ghosts the men in the black SUVs bring up here to die quietly." The air in my lungs felt like ice. "What does that mean?" Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. He set the driftwood aside and stood up, leaning on a gnarled staff. "I've lived at the end of this road for 30 years, son. Before you, there was a librarian from Philly. Before him, a dentist from Baltimore. They all come with the same brand new flannel shirts and the same look in their eyes, like they're waiting for the trees to start talking." He stepped to the edge of the porch, sniffing the air. "The Marshals tell you there's nobody out here. They tell us the same thing. It keeps the secrets tucked away, but the woods have a way of whispering." I relaxed my grip on the poker, but only slightly. "You're in the program too?" "Since the days when they used paper files and rotary phones," Silas said. He gestured to a second chair, a stump really, near his fire pit. "I was a bookkeeper for the outfit in Vegas. I knew where every dime was buried. Now, I just know where the chanterelles grow and which way the wind is blowing." He turned his clouded eyes toward the path I'd just walked. "You're worried about me, Thomas. Don't be. Worry about the woman you left behind in that fancy neighborhood. The Marshals think they scrubbed her clean, but a woman like that, she's a tick. Once they burrow in, they don't let go just because someone tells them it's a federal crime." I thought of Beatrice Vane in her orange jumpsuit. "She's in prison, Silas. She's not coming here." "Stone walls don't stop a mind that's obsessed with order," Silas warned. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, handheld radio, the kind hunters use. "I heard the chatter on the scanners this morning. Someone's been asking questions about unmapped parcels on the peninsula, using a legal firm out of Seattle." My phone, the safe one, vibrated in my pocket. "Deputy M, urgent. Vane's legal counsel has filed a discovery motion that includes your relocation coordinates. The judge stated, but the leak is out. We are prepping a secondary extraction. Stay put." I looked at Silas. The blind bookkeeper from Vegas was already heading back into his shanty. "The flu sticks, Thomas," he called over his shoulder. and the wind is shifting. You might want to get back. You've got company coming, and they aren't bringing sourdough." The hike back to my cabin felt twice as long as the trek out. The mud sucked at my boots with a rhythmic, wet slap, like the earth itself was trying to pull the Thomas Miller persona into the dirt. Silas's words and that frantic vibration in my pocket had stripped away the last layer of my suburban camouflage. I wasn't a park ranger. I was a man in a box, and the lid was being pried open by a woman who refused to stay buried. I didn't go through the front door. I slipped around the side, my back pressed against the rough-hewn logs, listening to the drip of the eaves. I entered through the mudroom, moving with the silent, balanced gait of the man I used to be in Jersey. I didn't turn on a single light. The cabin was a cavern of shadows, smelling of damp wool and old wood smoke. I pulled the encrypted tablet from its hollowed-out hiding spot beneath the floorboards. User, T. Miller, 7, to Deputy M message. Silas was right. He's been intercepting scanner chatter on a hacked radio. Who is the firm in Seattle? How do they get the coordinates? This wasn't a lucky guess. The reply was almost instantaneous, the blue light of the screen bleeding into the dark room. Deputy M, urgent. Vane's lead attorney is a shark named Holloway. He filed a habeas motion in a closed session, claiming you're being held against your will to prevent her from proving her innocence. The leak is human, Thomas. A clerk in Mason County is a cousin of one of Vane's old HR lackeys. They sold the GPS ping for 6 figures. We have a tactical team 20 minutes out. Lockdown and dark. 20 minutes. In the city, 20 minutes is a coffee break. In the woods, it's an eternity. It's long enough for a man to bleed out or for a life to be erased. I moved to the window, peeling back the heavy canvas curtain just an inch. The fog had thickened, turning the pines into jagged black ghosts. Then I saw it. A sharp, surgical flash of white light miles down the track. A vehicle. Not the heavy, authoritative rumble of a Marshals Suburban, but something lighter, faster. A European engine, tuned for precision. I reached into the emergency kit the Marshals had tucked into the false bottom pantry. Inside wasn't a fly fishing reel or a book on local flora. It was a Glock 17, 3 spare magazines, and a tactical flashlight. The weight of the polymer in my hand felt more natural, more honest than any park ranger's tool. I checked the chamber, click slide, and felt the cold copper of the first round seat itself. The white lights disappeared as the vehicle hit the dip in the road, then reappeared much closer, slicing through the mist. They weren't using high beams anymore, just low-profile fog lights. Professional. Predatory. I retreated to the loft, crawling up the ladder and positioning myself behind the heavy oak railing. From there, I had a clear kill zone view of the front door and the clearing. A black crossover pulled into my driveway, its engine idling with a low, expensive purr that sounded like money and malice. A man stepped out. He wasn't wearing a suit, and he didn't look like a lawyer. He was wearing high-end tactical gear, the matte black nylon and reinforced knee pads of a private military contractor. He held a tablet in one hand, glancing at a blinking red dot that represented my life. "Mr. Ashford?" he called out. His voice was projected, calm, and utterly chilling. It was the voice of a man who had done this in deserts and dark alleys alike. "My name is Elias. I'm a private consultant for Miss Beatrice Vane. She's very concerned about your well-being. She believes you're being coerced by the state." I stayed silent. I didn't even breathe. I watched him through the sights of the Glock. "I know you're in there, Arthur," Elias continued, stepping onto the porch. The wood groaned under his tactical boots. "I've seen your thermal signature through the logs. Don't make this a forced compliance issue. Beatrice just wants the truth. She wants her life back. And she's willing to pay quite a bit to make sure yours ends quietly." He reached for the door handle, the very spot where Silas's note had been tucked hours earlier. He wasn't reaching for a knocker. He was reaching for a breaching charge. "Wrong choice, Arthur," he whispered to the door. Just as his hand touched the metal, a sudden deafening crack echoed through the trees. It wasn't a gunshot. It was the sound of a massive hemlock limb snapping under pressure. Elias spun around. His suppressed pistol cleared from its holster in a blur of motion. But he was too slow for the terrain. Out of the fog emerged a figure that looked less like a man and more like a vengeful forest spirit. It was Silas. He wasn't wearing his flannel or carrying a whittling knife. He was draped in a tattered ghillie suit that made him invisible against the brush, and he was holding an old, short-barreled 12-gauge shotgun. He was standing 10 feet behind the black crossover, appearing as if he'd grown out of the mud. "This is a private road, son," Silas rasped, the red glow of his own headlamp cutting a bloody line through the mist. "And I believe you're violating several local ordinances regarding unauthorized entry and disturbing the peace." Elias leveled his suppressed weapon at the old man's chest. "Back off, Gramps. This is a high-level civil matter. You're interfering with a legal service." "I don't see a process server," Silas said, his finger tightening on the front trigger. "I just see a man with a silencer trespassing in my woods. In these parts, that's called a target." I leaned out of the loft window, the Glock leveled at the back of Elias's head. "Drop the piece, Elias, or the aesthetic harmony of this porch is going to get real messy real fast." The professional was caught. He was squeezed between a ghost in the loft and a blind man with a scattergun in the fog. He looked from me to Silas, his thumb hovering over the safety of his pistol. For a second, the only sound was the rain hitting the tin roof and the ticking of his cooling engine. Then, from far down the fire road, the real siren started, the low, pulsing wail of the Marshals' tactical unit. "You're out of time," I said, "and Beatrice is out of favors." The sirens didn't wail like city cops. They were low, pulsing thrumming sounds that vibrated through the floorboards before they ever hit the ear. Three black Suburbans crested the muddy ridge, their high beams cutting through the fog like tactical sabers. Elias didn't hesitate. He was a professional, and professionals aren't paid to die for a woman in an orange jumpsuit. He dropped his suppressed pistol onto the rotting porch boards with a dull thud and raised his hands, the red dot from Silas's headlamp still dancing over his heart like a laser-guided omen. "Federal agents, down on the ground, now!" The clearing erupted in a chaotic symphony of heavy boots and shouted commands. Marshals in full tactical kit swarmed the crossover, hitting Elias with the coordinated force of a tidal wave. They didn't treat him like a process server. They treated him like a high-value combatant. I stayed in the loft, my Glock still leveled, the front sight steady on the back of Elias's tactical vest until Deputy Miller's voice cracked through the noise. "Thomas, clear. Safety on. Come down slow." I descended the ladder, my legs feeling like lead. When I stepped onto the porch, the freezing rain was already washing the mud off Elias's face as he was pressed into the dirt, zip ties ratcheting shut around his wrists. Silas was gone, melted back into the tree line like he'd never been there at all. Only the snapped hemlock limb and the smell of ozone remained as proof of the old man's intervention. "You okay?" Miller asked, grabbing my shoulder and turning me toward the light. He looked frayed, his tactical vest pulled tight over a wrinkled dress shirt that suggested he'd flown straight from a DC briefing. "I'm fine," I said, my gaze fixed on the black crossover. What was he actually here for, Miller? Beatrice doesn't have the liquid capital for a contractor of this caliber. This guy is ex-group, at least. She didn't pay him in cash, Miller said, nodding toward a tech specialist who was already rifling through Elias's vehicle with a handheld scanner. She paid him in access, in leverage. The specialist pulled a ruggedized, Pelican brand briefcase from the passenger footwell. It was lined with lead foil and required a biometric thumbprint to engage the locks. Miller watched as his guy bypassed the hardware with a portable hack deck. When the lid clicked open, the screen of an internal laptop glowed a sickly, fluorescent green. "Take a look at this, Thomas," Miller whispered, his voice uncharacteristically hollow. It wasn't just a file on me. It was a digital burn file, the holy grail of Beatrice Vane's obsession. She hadn't just been snooping on her neighbors in Cedar Cove for sport or to maintain property values. She had been building a massive, interconnected blackmail database. "She wasn't just looking for your identity," Miller explained, as we scrolled through a directory of folders. "She had a list of every undesirable she'd ever flagged. She had the private tax records of the Mason County clerk. She had the secret search history of the judge who handled her initial hearing. She even had the mistress's phone number for the lead attorney at Holloway's firm. She didn't just want out. She wanted to own the people who could let her out." Beatrice hadn't been defending aesthetic harmony. She had been running a suburban intelligence agency from a kitchen table covered in floral lace. Elias wasn't just a consultant. He was a broker. He'd been sent to retrieve the master drive, the one Beatrice had hidden in a dead drop near my cabin's coordinates, encrypted with a key only she held. She used you, Thomas, Miller said, his jaw tight. She knew that if she could tie her secret files to a federal witness relocation site, the sheer legal chaos and the breach of WITSEC protocol would force a mistrial. She was going to burn the whole program down, endanger every witness we have, just to walk back into her cul-de-sac. I looked at the screen. There was a folder labeled Architectural Deviations. Inside weren't photos of unapproved paint colors. They were high-resolution blueprints of government safe houses, intercepted courier routes, and the real names of 3 other witnesses she'd managed to cross-reference using the same facial recognition AI she'd used on me. She's not just a bored HOA president anymore, I said, the weight of the conspiracy sinking in. She's a national security threat. Exactly, Miller replied. Which means the deal is off. She's not going to a minimum security facility with a tennis court and a library. She's being moved to ADX Florence under a special administrative measure. Total isolation. No clipboards, no neighbors, no secrets. She'll spend 23 hours a day in a concrete box, wondering if the guard's uniform is the correct shade of blue. I looked out into the dark woods, toward the fire road where Silas lived. He'd known. He'd seen ghosts like me come and go, and he knew that the world outside was just as petty and dangerous as the one I'd left behind. And what about the people she already outed? The ones in those files? Miller didn't look at me. He looked at the rain. We're moving them tonight. All of them, including you. Cedar Cove was a failure, but this was a catastrophe. I felt a sudden sharp pang of exhaustion. I was tired of being a ghost. I was tired of harvest sand, and I was tired of damp cabins and the smell of pine. Where to this time? I asked. Miller finally looked up, a small, tired smile on his face. Somewhere she never looked. Somewhere so disorganized, so loud, and so chaotic that a secret file doesn't mean a damn thing because nobody is even looking at their neighbors. The transition was a violent shock to the system. I had gone from the stifling, manicured silence of Cedar Cove to the dripping isolation of the peninsula, and now I was being spat out into the abrasive, neon-soaked lungs of Chicago. I was no longer Thomas Miller. I was Leo Michaels, a night shift logistics coordinator for a trucking firm that existed mostly on paper. My new harvest sand was a crumbling brick walk-up in a neighborhood where the only aesthetic harmony was the layer of soot covering every surface. The air didn't smell like cedar or pine. It smelled of diesel exhaust, old grease, and the metallic tang of the L train that shrieked past my window every 11 minutes. Nobody here cares if your bins are 18 inches from the curb, Leo, Deputy Miller had told me as he handed over the keys to the unit. He looked like he hadn't slept since the peninsula. In fact, if you actually use a bin, you'll be the most suspicious person on the block. Just throw your trash in the chute and keep your head down. I stood in the center of the one-bedroom apartment. The linoleum was peeling at the corners, and the radiator hissed like a cornered snake. I didn't check for bugs this time. I didn't check the floorboards. I just sat on a thrift store sofa that smelled of stale cigarettes and watched the shadows of the elevated train track dance across the ceiling. For the first time in months, I didn't feel watched, but I also didn't feel real. In Cedar Cove, Beatrice Vane's obsession had given me a shape. Her scrutiny, as toxic as it was, had confirmed my existence. Here, in the belly of the city, I was just another gray blur in a sea of millions. People pushed past me on the sidewalk without a glance. My landlord didn't know my name, only my unit number. By the end of the first week, the anonymity started to feel like a different kind of prison. I went to a local diner at 3 a.m., my new morning. The waitress slid a cup of burnt coffee in front of me without looking up from her phone. A man 2 stools down was talking to himself, and nobody moved to stop him. There were no safety seminars, no welcome packets, and certainly no architectural review committees. I found myself walking past a neighborhood park, a patch of dead grass surrounded by a chain-link fence. A woman was letting her dog roam off-leash, in direct violation of a faded city sign. I felt a phantom itch in my hand to reach for a clipboard. I wanted to tell her about the rules. I wanted someone to acknowledge that the rules existed. I realized then that Beatrice Vane hadn't just been a villain. She had been a mirror. Without someone trying to find out who I was starting to forget myself. I returned to my apartment and opened the encrypted tablet. It was the only thing that linked me to a world where I mattered. User Ellen_88. To PDM message. The noise is constant. The air is filth. I'm invisible. Mission accomplished? The reply didn't come for an hour. Deputy M. Vane's final appeal was denied this morning. She's officially in ADX. The burn files have been neutralized. You are as safe as a man can be, Leo. Enjoy the silence. Silence, I muttered as the L train roared past, shaking the windows in their frames. I walked to the window and looked down at the street. A car was parked illegally in front of a fire hydrant. A trash can had been overturned, spilling its contents across the sidewalk. It was a mess. It was chaos. It was everything Beatrice Vane would have hated. And yet, as I watched a man in a dark hoodie stop to look at my building's entrance, the old instinct flared. He wasn't looking at the trash or the car. He was looking at the windows, one by one. I stepped back into the shadows. I was in a city of millions, but the habit of being hunted doesn't wash off in a Chicago rain. The L train shrieked past my window at 4:14 a.m., a mechanical banshee that rattled the loose change on my dresser. In Cedar Cove, a sound like that would have triggered an emergency HOA board meeting and a 3-page memo on noise pollution. Here, it was just the heartbeat of a city that didn't care if I slept or died. I was Leo Michaels now. I wore a grease-stained Navy work jacket and carried a plastic thermos. My Des Moines actuary accent had been filed down into a flat, tired Midwestern mumble. I stood by the window, my back to the peeling wallpaper, watching the man in the dark hoodie. He was still there, leaning against a rusted lamppost across the street. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't waiting for a bus. He was staring at the third floor of my building. The old paranoia, the only thing I truly owned anymore, began to hum. I didn't call Miller. I didn't reach for the encrypted tablet. Instead, I did something Arthur Ashford never would have done. I walked out the front door, down the salt-stained stairs, and stepped directly onto the sidewalk. The humidity hit me like a wet towel. I walked toward the man, my hands deep in my pockets, my fingers curled around nothing but air. I didn't have a Glock anymore. The Marshals had decided Leo Michaels didn't need one in a city this anonymous. The man didn't move as I approached. As I got within 10 feet, he pushed back his hood. It wasn't a hitman. It wasn't a marshal. It was a kid, maybe 20 years old, with eyes that looked like they'd seen too many basement ceilings. "You're the guy from 3C, he said. It wasn't a question. "Who's asking?" I kept my voice low, blending into the rumble of a passing garbage truck. "My aunt," the kid said. He reached into his pocket. I tensed, my weight shifting to the balls of my feet. He pulled out a crumpled envelope. "She told me if I ever found you, I was supposed to give you this. Said you'd know what it meant." I took the envelope. It was cheap, standard issue stationery. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside. I could feel the stiff, rectangular shape of a photograph. I walked back into the lobby of my building, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. I tore the envelope open. It was a photo of the Cedar Cove entrance sign, the one with the gold leaf lettering and the perfectly manicured begonias. But someone had defaced it. Someone had spray painted a single word across the aesthetic harmony slogan in bright, jagged red: Ghost. On the back of the photo, in the sharp, cramped handwriting of a woman who lived for the Covenants, were 4 words: "I see you, Arthur." A cold chill that had nothing to do with the Chicago winds settled in my bones. Beatrice Vane was in a supermax prison, 3 states away, in a concrete box designed to swallow souls. Yet, she had still managed to reach out from the dark. She had used her secret files, her HR connections, and her web of favors to find the one person who had escaped her kingdom. She didn't want to kill me. That would be too simple. She wanted me to know that as long as she existed, I would never be invisible. I would always be a deviation. I would always be non-compliant. I walked over to the building's trash chute. I looked at the photo one last time. The red paint, the golden sign, the ghost of a life I'd almost started to believe in. I dropped it into the dark hole. I heard it flutter down, hitting the pile of coffee grounds and discarded dreams at the bottom of the bin. I went back up to 3C and sat on my thrift store sofa. I didn't check the windows. I didn't look at the tablet. I just listened to the L train. Beatrice Vane was right about one thing. A quiet life leaves a trail. But a silent one? A silent one is a lie. I wasn't an actuary, a ranger, or a logistics coordinator. I was a man waiting for the next knock on the door. In a city where nobody knocks unless they're bringing trouble, I closed my eyes and waited for the sun to rise over the soot. The aesthetic harmony was gone, but the hunt was eternal. And that's today's story. I hope you enjoyed the change of pace. How would you have coped if you were in the situation that Arthur found himself in? Do you think Beatrice will remain happy to just keep tabs on Arthur from inside ADX? Or is she the sort to try and escalate? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you made it this far, I'd appreciate you dropping a like or a subscribe. And I'll catch you all next time.